So we're going to be talking this morning with our panel about the firsthand stories from maintainers on open source. So starting with our panel, we have Andrew, who is a senior software engineer at Ivan and also an OpenSearch maintainer. He is hailing from Montreal and is also a member of the Apache Project Management Committee. So thank you this morning for coming with us, Andrew.
Thank you. Hello, guys.
Hello. We also have Madeline, who's a senior software engineer at AWS. Madeline is a Redis maintainer and also from Seattle and a lover of fractals, which is fascinating math for anyone who does not know. So welcome this morning.
Hello, glad to be here.
Additionally, we have Rose Judge, who's a senior open source engineer at VMware. She maintains the Turn project, is coming to us from Portland, Oregon. And she wants to change the perception that you need to be super skilled to contribute to open source. So we're super happy to have you here this morning, Rose.
Hi.
And lastly, but not least, we have DB, or Daniel, who is a principal software engineer at AWS. He's a maintainer on the OpenSearch project, and he's been contributing to open source for the last 20 years and has been a maintainer on several big Ruby projects such as Grape, and I'm going to mispronounce this, not really, Hashi. So welcome, DB.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Also super happy to have Chris as our moderator this morning. Thank you so much. And with that, we're going to go ahead and start rolling into some of the questions that we have. So to start out with, let's talk about what got you into maintaining. So Rose, I'd actually like to hear from you first on this because you have a really interesting perspective on what it means to contribute to open source. So I'd like to hear some more about what got you into maintaining open source.
Yeah, so I think I have a little different path than others. I actually got started just through my job. It wasn't like something I was doing on the weekend, or it was just I got a new job at VMware, and part of the role was maintaining this project, or at least ramping up to be a maintainer for Turn. So I feel lucky that I got started that way, because I think I had always thought of open source as something that was not for me, just because I, didn't contribute. It wasn't something I tinkered with all the time. But coming from that different perspective, it gave me a lot of confidence to kind of get started in other open source communities and other open source projects where I maybe wouldn't have had the courage to get started otherwise, had I not had this in through my job.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to hear from everyone else as well. What kind of got you into maintaining open source? Was it like Rose, part of your job, or, kind of what brought you into this world?
So similar to Rose, I was like interested in open source as a concept. Like when I was in college, I really thought of myself as someone who wanted to contribute, but I didn't know how. But I also got my opportunity through work where, so I work on Amazon Elasticache, which is the managed Redis service in AWS. And one of the problems we were having is we were writing a bunch of code and it was becoming hard to maintain. And so I was the one that sort of pushed the initiative, well, maybe we should push it to open source and then the community can maintain it instead of us. That sounds a little maniacal, but the open source would also benefit a lot from it. There's a lot of synergy there. And so that's how I wrote a bunch of docs and convinced our leadership that, hey, let's go contribute to open source. And so that's how I sort of got my way in. And yeah, I also really like that. Well, I always say my main contribution to the Redis open source project is I created a Slack group. Because at the time there wasn't a development community, it was just it was basically one guy and he was off in Italy and he never really responded. And so having the Slack group helped a lot. So I want to highlight that you can be non-technical and still contribute a lot to open source as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. DB or Andrew?
Yeah, let me go first, DB, sorry. Yeah, for me, I guess it's a little bit different story. I guess I fall in this trap. I fell this trap, as Earl said. I waited too long to start it, to be I would say serious developer, but actually I always wanted to give back because I'm basically developing all my life. I use different projects, different languages all the time of career, and I always wanted to help other projects to move forward. And at some point decided, yes, I can do that. So I decided to pick a couple of projects where my expertise actually could be useful. Community was super welcome for me. I started with a small contributions and ramping up different issues, scopes, and everything. At some point, become maintainer. And I was very lucky one with OpenSearch team. And even as my employee, where actually my job is now just to be open source maintainer.
That's phenomenal.
That's phenomenal. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
For sure. What about you, DB?
Yeah, so I'd have to go back to 2003. In 2003, 2004, I was working at a database security company in New York, and we needed to chain some installers together, and we were using Install Shield, and that was a suboptimal experience. So I was looking for something better because we just couldn't make it work for our scenario. I found this article on Code Project called .NET Installer of some Italian developer that wrote a tool that just did it. It was open source. And then by 2005, I added a couple of features which we needed at this job and re-uploaded them to Code Project. So that worked. And the guy disappeared, vanished completely and gone. So by 2008, I had moved the project to GitHub, became its default maintainer, just continued developing it. Interestingly, he reappeared around 2014. He took a 10-year sabbatical and went and grew a vineyard in northern Italy. I still have never met him, but he's back on the internet. That was my first open source experience.
That is kind of hilarious. And you talk about, taking a sabbatical. So I'd like to kind of dive into that. Maybe DB, you can lead this one up. What kind of role do you feel like you take as an open source maintainer? Like, referring to it as a sabbatical kind of leads into it. Is it a job? Is it something you do for fun? Is it, can it be both?
Oh, well, no, this individual took a real sabbatical. He disconnected from the internet completely. So I just inherited the project. I was the only other contributor, and I became maintainer like such. I certainly don't think maintaining open source projects is a sabbatical by any means. It's actually the opposite, I think, of a sabbatical.
Yeah, no kidding. I'd like to get some other thoughts on that. Like, what does it mean to be a maintainer on an OpenSearch project or open source project? Like, what are the responsibilities there?
I think that it kind of is, it depends on like where you're at in your project roadmap. I think the answer differs. Like when you're in a development period where you're trying to get some new features merged or like some high severity bug fixes or vulnerabilities patched, then there's a lot more work to be done there, and your presence is noticed a lot more. But then, like any project, there's also going to be kind of periods of lulls where maybe you're attending, like the summer gets really busy with conferences, and so there's kind of less development going on there. There's more like networking and connections being made outside of the project, and maybe you're not as needed every day like on GitHub. Or at least with Turn, I've noticed that it's kind of cyclical like that. It goes in waves of like where it's really important that you're there directing the project, responding to PRs, like resolving bugs, and then other times where you being not fully present on GitHub all the time isn't as crucial.
Yeah, for sure.
I think for me, it would be just to basically help to move the project forward, maintain it as in good health itself, plus help users to actually solve their problem as fast as possible, not block them. I mean, there's always difficult to everyone has opinions. We don't fight for perfection. Some contributions are very valuable, but could be made better, but it should not stop. You have to make this judgment. Okay, let's get it in because it solves your problem, and then we'll fix it later. But it also very depend on the project. Like, is it hyperscale, hypergrowth project which like has thousands of maintainers, contributors? I've never been part of these projects, but I think it's significantly more pressure and a little bit different kind of nature of maintaining such projects. I was lucky one in the sense that I don't have this. All my free time is not going to peer reviews and everything. I do have time to contribute as well, but I think it's very, very, very dependent on the projects. It could be a very difficult job.
Absolutely. Kind of bouncing off of that, what sort of things, lead to a contribution being rejected? You mentioned, you trying to kind of protect the project and make sure that, the best interest is always met. Are examples of that just like, someone thoughtlessly kind of put something in, or what leads in you guys' head to like, I should probably not accept this into the community, and what can people do about that?
This is maybe I will continue. This is a very difficult question. Basically, when you can sometimes you can just feel that people push something that is very, very specific to their needs, like this specific feature. You just see it. Okay, this is like it's for community. It's not going to be a good contribution for a project. It's like some specific small change with so specific, very specific user problem. And then these kind of contributions, you just to see if there's potential to make it generic feature or more useful feature, or we just say, you know what, we have workaround, we have different ways to achieve the same goals. We just won't be able to accommodate this. Because every single feature like that basically adds a maintenance. You have to remember it. You have to know it's there. And we try to. I don't have many examples. Fortunately, at least for me, I don't have many examples of features we had to reject or not accept. But sometimes it happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, at least from my experience, like the complexity thing is definitely a big thing where someone asks for something very specific that's very hard to maintain, especially if it comes from someone who like isn't in the community. It's some just person who like ran into a problem, they wanted to fix it. And a lot of them come with like good intentions, but if they're not willing to stick around to help maintain it, it becomes a lot harder to justify pulling in and maintaining it. And we've seen a lot of people who like already like, one thing about Redis, which I think is maybe pretty common amongst other projects, a lot of people fork it internally, make their necessary change, and then kind of want to contribute it back. And so if we push back at all and being like, hey, we can make it a little more generic if you just do these like couple of things, a lot of times they'll just say no and just abandon it. And like, that's usually the main reason we reject stuff, is they just sort of get abandoned. A lot of people who are invested in open source are willing to sort of work with us to make a feature generic enough for the community. And then we're usually willing to accept it.
Interesting. Do you guys find? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, DB.
Yeah, my rule of thumb is pretty simple. If a pull request improves the project by even the slightest amount, I would say it's a yes. If it's a regression backwards into making it worse, I would say it's a no. So I reject anything that makes the project worse. And it's loosely defined by me, the maintainer, plus obviously all the other maintainers on the project. But as maintainers, our job is to make things better. So show us that it's better. That's it. For things like the PR is missing tests, like we're not rejecting those. We're just asking for more work to be done. And I think improvements, like here's a more generic version of making. You've made a good suggestion. This is a great feature for Redis, but I think there's a more generic version of this implementation. I think these are just increments, and I hope the contributor will stick around to go and make these changes. I think when you're asked to do more work, that's actually a great thing. It gets you closer to getting the PR merged.
Yeah, absolutely. So just talking about people sticking around, let's talk about, what leads a project to bring on new maintainers? How do you find new maintainers? How do you know that they're going to be a quality add for the community? What are your thoughts on that? I'm going to start with Rose.
I think this is one of the hardest parts of open source, is finding that, like, similar to what the others have echoed, is it's hard to find people that want to stick around. Like, you get a lot of people that pop in and out, and even like with some organizations like GSOC, you can find interns who for a whole summer are, want to help, and then getting the retention is really the difficult part of getting people to stick around. I think especially, with, if people are just doing this in their free time, it's hard to recruit people that way because it's so dependent on what goes on outside of work, or what they do for work, what other things are occupying their time, and it's hard to make judgments about how committed they're able to be. I really don't have a good answer for this, because Turin has struggled to find like people that can full-time maintain the project that aren't coming like that without it being tied to their employment somehow. So I'd be really curious what others have to say, but I think this is one of the biggest struggles in open source, is trying to find people who are, going to show up, and that you can really depend on.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say that if anyone also does, we are also having the same problem at Redis, where we need more people who are committed and will be there long term. One thing I will somewhat disagree with, though, is I think so all of the 5 main maintainers of Redis are employed by people that run Redis cloud providers, and I think that does provide kind of a stable bedrock for the project we've built on top of. But we're still trying to find people from the community who are engaged and interested. But the benefit of having people that use Redis at work and are employed through work is that they are usually way more consistent. The people who do this just for fun sometimes just disappear for months at a time, and we don't know where they go. And then they come back and they're like, yeah, I just had, some personal or work thing, and so I just kind of left. Whereas the people who are employed typically are more responsive and more engaged in the project. But yeah, we need more people who are committed, and it's really hard to find them.
Yeah. Maybe they went to a vineyard.
Peter had a really good follow-up question as part of this. How do you handle when contributors don't stick around to add those improvements?
I think you can't expect contributors to stick around at all. Anybody on open source projects gives the time that they are interested in giving it. So in radical experimentation, a project by a former coworker of mine, Orta, I forget which one, but has enabled every committer to become a co-maintainer of the project. So every time you had APR merged, then you were invited to be a co-maintainer. And that worked surprisingly well as a radical experiment. Most of them would never stick around, but it did create some people who got very engaged in it. To my personal smaller projects, I ask anyone who's adding a feature and who I think is capable of delivering a release, and I think the feature is of good quality, to come and become a co-maintainer and make the next release, because they have their feature that just got merged. So they're super interested in getting involved somehow.
Really interesting way to loop them into the process. Yeah, could totally see how that could help.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, you cannot do anything with it. Just people do not have full-time availability for your projects. Always will be maintainers or contributors who won't stick for a long time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's just nature of it.
I agree with PB that there's no way that you can expect people to stick around long-term. As a maintainer, I'm just honestly thankful whenever I get someone to open a PR or fix a bug, or even open an issue to let us know that there's a bug in something. I'm thankful for all of those contributions, no matter how big or small. And I think to answer Peter's question of how do you handle it when they don't stick around, it's every PR that you merge from somebody is you make a risk calculation of okay, what you kind of have to assume that they're not going to be there long term. So is this something that I feel comfortable maintaining? Is it something that will hold for a while. You know, if I don't know how to maintain or I don't know how to fix it, or do we have a couple months where it might take a couple months for them to get back to me if, you know, I have a question about it. Like, I think when you're merging stuff from contributors that you don't know if they're going to be there long term, you're just kind of constantly making risk-based calculations of, is it worth it? Is this something that my project needs? You know, how much is it going to make it better versus add like maintenance burden or technical debt? It's kind of just a constant calculation.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking a little bit more about communication, right? It's challenging being in an open source project because, you know, everyone meets kind of on GitHub online. A lot of times they're distributed across time zones. How are you guys using any sort of tools to help you manage that? Or how are you communicating? What do you find the best avenue is for your communities?
So I guess in Redis, so everything technical should stay on GitHub. We try to not be opaque about that, but we have a separate Slack group which tries to, like, if you're talking with another person that contributes a lot and you want to just like have a conversation back and forth very quickly with them, it's usually better to have it over, like we can like do a Slack huddle to just kind of like chat something through. And on top of that, we think it's really important to have like meetups with all like the people that contribute. So we try to do that 2 to 3 times a year. I'll caveat that this is the Redis as a development community has only existed basically in the pandemic time. So we are trying now to figure out how do we make everyone like get together in person, but we haven't figured that out yet. But that's sort of what we've noticed. It's just, you know, regular sync ups and then trying to keep everything technical on GitHub.
I guess same for, at least for me, I try to keep everything on GitHub to be always available at least there. Other channels do not work very well. Some projects do have Jiras or other kind of ticketing systems. You have to go through that. But usually if it ends up on GitHub and PR, you just keep this channel of communication open all the time and watch it. We'll say it works best, at least for me.
Real quick, so we've talked a lot about employers and your kind of relationship, you know, being employed to work on open source, which I just want to say, number one is the coolest thing. How can you bring, or what's kind of the value add? You know, Madeline, you kind of mentioned that a lot of the people you find in the Redis community are employed as managed service providers for Redis. Are there other scenarios where you guys feel like an employer should be contributing to open source? Do you feel like that belongs in every workplace?
I genuinely think that if it makes sense, if like both parties get something out of it, I think more employers and more companies should be contributing to open source. But I do also think that there's plenty of places where it just doesn't make any sense. Like I try not to be too much of a optimist with open source, expecting companies to contribute when they have no incentive to. Like at least with AWS, in a lot of places, there's a lot of synergies to contributing to open source and making the open source community more vibrant. And like, I think one of the reasons that Redis is so successful is because it's open source and it's so ubiquitous, everyone uses it, it's free, it's open source. And so there is benefit in like AWS contributing to continue growing that. So my general comment is just, you know, when it makes sense, they should be. And I think in a lot of places, a lot of companies are afraid to let their employees contribute because like, you know, they're giving away IP, or maybe the employee, like, I don't know, they just like want to get the code out and then leave and go use it somewhere else. And I think a lot of those risks are just overblown. And in most cases, it would just be better if they contributed to open source more.
I feel like a lot of times this idea of, oh, you contribute to open source is an extra additional nice to have benefits society type of activity. As much as I care about how it benefits society, I think it's absolutely fine to have selfish interests of a corporation which pays you to do work and align those interests. So I agree that when things benefit everyone, it's the best outcome. And it's exactly true that for something like Redis, it benefits AWS to contribute to the Redis project because, you know, AWS runs it. So I just think of it as like another style of development in a way you would choose Java versus Python versus Ruby versus something else, I think you should make a decision whether the project that you're writing should be open source or proprietary in a similar way. And there are pros and cons of every programming language and pros and cons of having an open shared code base or a proprietary closed code base for whatever reason that you may have. I don't think of open source as an upstream activity where we do a bunch of work and then give something away later for the greater good. I just think it's like a programming language choice.
I think it's someone reflecting the Daniel's thoughts. Like two models which are very interesting. There open source projects were heavily commercialized by one single company. Have a bunch of examples like that. And they have very, very strong core of developers who basically work for this company for doing open source and commercial stuff. And other extreme, you have projects who just live by themselves, used by many companies, and some people just come in, may contribute it from time to time. When you get paid for it, it's definitely, I think it's good for a project because you have a very stable core, at least for a while, and people do watch actually what is getting in, what is getting in, and actually just have enormous amount of time available for that. That's, I guess, finding balance is the best one, but having full-time people who work on a project is very, very, very important for open source projects to actually live longer and stay healthy longer. Would love to see more companies adopting this model at least.
Yeah, I think the perception is slowly changing that for so long it was like, why would I contribute to open source when I can just, use the code and don't have to do any work? And if we have to provide resources, then it becomes a cost. But I think the benefits are starting to become more clear to employers, and especially like when we think about supply chain security and risk calculations going into using open source, like it's probably safer to invest resources when like who's working on it and like how the project develops and how they patch vulnerabilities and how that community advances the code versus just blindly using something with no insight into the development process.
I will only add that I think this idea that open source is an expense is not true. I believe open source is cheaper overall, cheaper to write, cheaper to maintain, cheaper to develop, cheaper to use, and the total cost from security perspective, from all these aspects, is significantly lower than proprietary software. I think the only advantages of proprietary software is competitive IP.
I think that's all very true as well. But the one other thing I would add is there's also often a very strong perception within companies that it's easier if you control the entire stack to make changes to it. And so if you only want a small thing from an open source project, oftentimes they'll just make it internally and not contribute back. And so I actually think there's a lot of like people that basically do open source work with everything except the contribution back to the community, because that one part, there's no ROI for it. And I wish there was some way to resolve that as well, but it's often hard to align those.
Well, they're missing that opportunity of having you, Madeline, look at the code and say, you made a very grave mistake here. And
yeah,
your code doesn't work. So you'll find it out in production when your customers complain.
Yeah, that has happened. So yeah, that's a very good point as well.
Actually, this kind of ties into a question we got in the chat really well. Is there kind of an appropriate or inappropriate way to thank someone for their contribution? We talked about that ROI. I mean, a lot of us work at companies. Is it inappropriate for companies to pay for contributions, or what do you guys feel about that?
I just got $500 from GitHub as part of Maintain a month. I don't feel like GitHub is paying me for my contributions to open source. My employer, AWS, pays me quite well for my contributions to open source. I think it's beyond the point. Again, open source is just a style of development. Should we pay Java developers more than Ruby developers? No, you should be paid for the value you provide to the company.
Yeah, it's a small monetary value is like, don't do that. someone like gave me $5 in GitHub once. I'm like, I appreciate it, but this doesn't mean anything. I do like swag though. If you ever like make Redis swag, like there's a company called Redis Limited who like is the main contributor or the one who contributes a lot to Redis, and they send swag to all the maintainers, and I know people really like that. So I will say that is a good thing to do.
I guess for some people, money sometimes is a motivation. So if you even a small amount of it, they will try to contribute something. So I don't think it's bad, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, I think like the biggest way you can thank a maintainer is like with your contributions, like opening a bug or opening a PR, fixing a bug. That is, as somebody who gets paid by my employer to work on open source, like that is more meaningful to me than because it makes my life easier, it makes my job easier. So and it also makes the project better. So it's like a win-win-win when you have people doing that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
And make people feel good. Be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's good to say, wow, I'm impressed by this spline that you've reticulated in this pull request. I think that's awesome. Like compliment people and help them in any way you can.
Yeah.
Along those lines, people have been sharing how they got into open source, like Amitai and Peter in the chat. So if anyone wants to add their story into the chat, please do. Please share.
So question for, I'm going to target this one at Rose. Do you have any advice for new maintainers to projects? So you mentioned you kind of came in through VMware into Turn. Like, what were some things that you wish you knew or that could help someone new to maintaining get started?
New to maintaining, I would say make sure that you understand like all of the Git workflows really well. Like once you're a maintainer and you have all this, you have a lot of permissions of changes that you're able to make to the repository, just make sure you know what you're doing. I made some mistakes early on overwriting some commits, and you know, that was not my proudest moment, but I did learn a lot from it. But it's also, I would say, yeah, just make sure that you're aware of the power that you have in making changes, because and also just to make sure that you really understand like the direction and the roadmap of the project. I think as a maintainer, it's easy to think like, oh, okay, I'm just going to review a PR and we'll get it merged and I'm going to cut the release. I'm going to do these like more routine tasks, but sometimes merging like a bunch of smaller PRs can slow you down or detract away from like the big goal of where you're headed. And so just to make sure that you have an understanding of like where you want the project to go, so that every PR you merge, every bug you fix is like taking you closer to that goal and not adding technical debt or moving you further away from it.
I would just add to that, never assume that you know the project the best as like anyone else, and that you're the smartest guy in the room. You won't imagine how many people will come up with interesting solutions to the problems you thought already solved. And always keep open-minded and try to understand like why the people did that and why you didn't do the same way if it's a much better solution than your project implemented in the first place. I guess this is very, very interesting, and you just have to accept that you will get much better the contributions than you have done or you will be able to do at this particular moment of time.
Kind of jumping off of that, you know, we mentioned keeping that long-term vision of the project in mind. So what are some tools you guys are using in your communities to project that vision, you know, get people to buy in? Are you guys using like boards, tagging? What tools are in your tool belt for kind of keeping the community focused?
Honestly, we just maintain a file of like a, you know, text file on our GitHub of like where the project is headed, and kind of revisit that routinely. We writing, I would say like we write blog posts too about like new features or where we're headed, things that we're hoping to add. But it's, in terms of tools, it's pretty simple. GitHub is like your best friend. It's, you know, somewhere that if someone's looking at the project, like all of the information is right there of what they need and where the project's going.
OpenSearch has a quite an elaborate way of showing direction. There is a roadmap. There is like 50 repos with a bunch of components. Each one of them has a roadmap. That's the best reflection of the future that the team is thinking. And I think it's a bit challenging because that direction can change all the time, because community members come all the time and like add a feature that was never on the roadmap. How awesome. So it's not like you can add something anytime you want. So it's the best knowledge. And I think we are relatively inexperienced with how to do this well. It certainly doesn't work like most waterfall projects where like somebody decided to build a certain feature, then worked backwards from it and planned it and then executed. Like open source is different. I wonder how others see it on like Redis. It seems like we would learn a lot from that one.
No, we have no. I don't even know if it's fair to say we have a roadmap. Like we have a Google Doc with like 4 items in it. We're like, we'd like to see these 4 things in Redis someday. We have like a couple of projects that are like, you know, like next major release, and it's just a collection of notes of stuff. And yeah, I think we are not very good at having any type of roadmap. I think part of the problem with Redis is I mentioned before that, so it used to have, Redis used to have a BDFL, that a benevolent dictator for life maintained the project. And then he just sort of abruptly stepped away, like with no like warning, and then handed it over to a group of maintainers. And so we have kind of been in chaos mode for like a year and a half, trying to get it into a stable state. And we've just recently gotten to the point where like we can kind of project a roadmap now. And none of the maintainers are actually very good at it. So we're just kind of like, yeah, he's in the vineyard. There's a comment in chat. I am quite sure that's what our friendly Italian is doing. Yeah, I think of the things we need to work on as a project. It's like roadmap is the thing. And it's one of the things that we've spent some time on, but not enough.
Should everyone using Redis be terrified right now?
I think Redis is a very stable product right now, but what it's going to be in 5 years, I don't think anyone really knows.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to pitch that vision when you don't have, you know, a single owner. You know, it's very hard to reach consensus, both in distributed systems and open source projects, apparently.
Yeah, one other interesting thing about Redis is everyone kind of thinks Redis is something different. Like a lot of people use this as a primary database, people use it as a cache, people use it as a semi-durable data store, people use it as like a message broker. And so I think it's fair to say Redis isn't particularly good at any of them, but it's very flexible and can do a very large number of things pretty well. And so where do you take a product from there? It's kind of difficult to say.
That's a really interesting perspective because, you know, kind of how people use the project is how the project, I feel like, probably ends up going, you know. There's only so much control with the roadmap that you can do. Just like how I think everyone's familiar, or maybe they're not, with how GIFs actually started out. They were originally supposed to be an alternative to like a PowerPoint, but now they're used to share videos and memes of cats. It's a little interesting tidbit. With that, we're going to take a pause real quick and we're going to direct it to the community now. So does anyone have any questions for our maintainers that you've been, you know, kind of burning on your heart that you want to shout out? Please put it in the chat. As I say, shout out and then direct you to the chat. And from our maintainers, is there any one piece that you'd like to leave the community with? You know, what is your overarching recommendation? Is it just go contribute? Is it, you know, something else?
My recommendation is start with typos. When you go, the first time you encounter a project and you are like, how do I use this? if you, as you read the README and you see a typo, start by fixing that. And if it doesn't have how to use it, then go contribute that, etc. So start really small.
Yeah, it'll also help just you get used to like the Git workflows and actually opening a PR and making sure that you've signed your commits properly. And that I feel like I've always noticed has been one of the biggest barriers to contribution. Is sometimes we'll get like a really good PR and we're like, oh, we just need a commit message from you, and like, can you add a commit message? And then we never hear from them again because maybe they didn't know how to do that, or like things that seem like really trivial sometimes are the hardest part of actually contributing. So I second that. Start with a typo, start with something really, really small, and gain confidence from there.
Yeah, but don't be afraid you don't have enough expertise or experience to do that. You always have enough. Just you'll learn much faster and much better contributor and maintainer when you start. That's for sure.
Don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm always thrilled whenever like we get a question on our GitHub discussions or a GitHub issue. I'm like, this is really exciting. It means people are using it. People are interested. And I'm like, really, I want to help. So yeah, ask lots of questions.
Absolutely. So Amitai in the chat asks, do you think companies would contribute more if there was a clear SLA for them when the PR would be committed and to which version?
So this is a good one. I would say maybe progress is more important than concrete SLAs. When you see that your PR gets attention and there is progress, maybe not every day, let's say it's significantly, like every single time frame, you see that people are working towards getting it in, you can actually, it encourages a lot. You can see more companies can contribute to that. I believe honestly in that. SLAs may be even better times on versions when sometimes people just ask when this feature will be merged. Can I get the next release? Yes, for sure. Let's work together to make it in. And the next release comes in and you have this feature out.
Yeah, I think open source communities providing SLAs is very difficult to do because we often don't know when the next release will be. Like, I'm sure companies would love it if we could provide SLAs, but we usually can't even give a good estimate. But I do think having some amount of progress is definitely helpful to know that it's making progress. I can think of a lot of issues where someone's like, hey, this is breaking my production. Like, I will do whatever it takes to help you guys get this out. Like, is that worth doing? Or should I just go and fork your project and commit it and push it? So I agree with all of that.
Madeline's point, the best way to have SLAs, I think, is to have maintainers on the project. If your company employs someone who's a maintainer who is capable of doing a release, you can get your SLA. Would they contribute more? Well, start by adding maintainers, and then I don't think asking. I really feel strongly that we should not be asking maintainers to do anything in any contractual form or shape.
Good point. I have Zamitai. So regarding that point, I agree 100%. As you reduce you have full control when you're saying I'm also maintaining the project, so it makes a lot of sense. But companies, they want to start up, so that's when they start thinking about contributing, getting someone to be a maintainer, that's like a bigger leap. Would it be possible to say, like, I don't know how it works in Redis, do you know someone is working on it? Like, is there a maintainer reviewing it? How many PRs are being reviewed by how many maintainers? Kind of gives you a feel for how long it's going to take for this feature maybe to be in production, to be committed to some version.
The silence is telling, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have a lot of people actively currently. Like, we tell, like, one of the other things, as I said, like we were kind of like the maintainers were kind of given a project. When we were given the project, we had over 1,400 open issues and like 800 plus pull requests. And so like, some part of our time is like, we try to balance the time between like working on new features, triaging bugs, and like working on strategic like initiatives like infrastructure and restructuring. Like if you come to us and submit an issue, that's usually our highest priority. Like if there's a real bug, we'll usually fix it and get into a patch version as fast as we possibly can. Like features, it's often very hard for us to give a coherent date about, because we only do 2 like feature releases a year right now. And so a lot of people aren't very happy when we say like, oh, this will probably be in 7.2, which is ETA like next February is our current plan, which is just so far away that a lot of people will just kind of check out and go away. And I'm sure that definitely hurts contributions, but at the same time, like that's actually probably good for us because it provides some, pushback against constant feature requests. But yeah, we're hoping to get to a better state, but we're not there yet.
Thanks.
We had a really good question come in on the chat from Ashwin. What do you do if your company has restrictive policies for open source?
I will say when I started contributing, AWS had a very restrictive policy towards open source. AWS has become much more friendly to open source recently. And like basically every time I contributed any issue to open source, I'd open a ticket and have it reviewed by a lawyer to make sure we weren't like giving out any legal stuff. And it was a pain. It was so much work. And like, it was basically a process of, writing a bunch of documents, convincing leadership that there's value in us doing this and like pushing back against it. And I think this sort of gets back to what DB was saying earlier, that like, there has to be some mutual benefit there. Like if you work in a company and they have no value in open source, it's very hard to convince them to open up their policies. But in a lot of places, there are justifiable reasons to be more open about contributing and spending part of your time, especially if like your core business depends on an open source project. Like there's benefit in having a maintainer. It gets you the SLA. It gets you like in on what's going on. So that's what I would say.
I guess unfortunately this is a majority, at least at this moment of time. Companies do not really appreciate open source contributions. They just do it after work. Or change companies, which is lame advice, essentially. If you like it, you just like it, it works there, but you may just do contributions outside of working hours on your own hardware.
Yeah, I would just say that you need to be able to summarize and justify the benefits for your company. Like, from a company perspective, as Madeline has said, if they're not using a project that you want to contribute to, like it doesn't make sense for them to use resources to support that project. But if they're using a product or a project, then it makes more sense. So trying to connect that. I think even as somebody who gets paid by their employer to work on open source, like I still have to find business value in the communities I participate in. It's not like I just get to go and choose a random project and be like, I'm going to work on this. So even companies that are very open source friendly, like there still needs to be a value add related to your work.
I think you can choose to work on convincing your company to do otherwise, and maybe not to make those policies less restrictive, but making one contribution and then a second contribution, etc. Slowly get people more comfortable with the idea that it's okay and nothing is going to happen. It's only going to benefit the company. I had gone through this many times, or a couple of times in my career, and it's always been an uphill battle. The thing that really worked for me at this other companies, I showed how people are making money on open source. All these companies with open source software at their foundation, and as soon as the executive leadership saw the words money, it suddenly clicked, and then we contributed to a bunch of open source. And then the company went down for no reason, nothing to do with the open source projects. So, I'm absolutely serious, by the way.
I don't doubt you. You don't seem like the type to joke about that. So another question from the chat, Josh asks, do you use different GitHub accounts for personal contributions versus company contributions?
I just have one. that I use, but I think that also depends on company policy. But I mean, I think it makes more sense to just have the one.
Same for me. We allow, at least my company allows to use personal GitHub accounts for company-related contributions. So I use one.
I think you should use your personal because, I mean, you should at least strive to do so. Otherwise, you leave the company and there goes your, it's not even connected to you anymore. Nobody can reach you.
That's a fair
This is
point.
true. Yeah. Like maybe if your majority of contributions go to private repos, it's not a big deal. But when you're 100% or more than that on open source, it's basically better to use your public GitHub account. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to take a pause here. Just want to respect everyone's time. We're so thankful to the panel as well for coming out and answering all of these questions. Thank you to the audience for some of the great questions. I'm going to shout out OpenSearch. Thank you to OpenSearch for allowing us this time together to talk about what it means to maintain an open source community. If you'd like to know more about OpenSearch, check us out on opensearch.org or the OpenSearch Project. And also this was recorded, so this will be available at a future date and time. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Have a great one.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks.